Hello, I am Ottaviano Canuto, and I'm a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. I'm here today to talk about the global economic recovery and scars from coronavirus. The global economic activity has climbed up since June, but there are signs that the recovery may be losing momentum, that it is likely moderating. Instead of V, U, W, or L among the several shapes that have been thought of. As we argued before in this series, a square root looks more likely. And the crisis is likely to leave deep, unequal scars. And why is that we have a recovery under such conditions? Well, first of all, the pandemic is not yet under control. The virus has killed more than 1,300,000 people and continues to spread. Some economies have maintained persistently high infection rates or renewed pickups in the number of new cases. So lockdown relaxations have stalled or rules have been tightened again. We have had great news about several vaccines in late stage trials, but producing and widely distributing those vaccines will take time. Well, second, we have a very uneven recovery, including with respect to countries. The IMF is now forecasting that global growth in 2020 will be something around minus 4.4%, followed by a partial recovery in 2021. However, the recovery next year will probably be insufficient to lift output above the 2019 level in most advanced and emerging market economies, excluding China. You can see in this chart a very interesting and terrible trajectory when it comes to the three groups of countries here. See, these lines, the line in red in the case of China, the green line in the case of emerging markets and developing economies, exclusive China, and this is the case of advanced economies. And these dashed lines are, let's say, the trajectory envisaged by the IMF in the beginning of the year, that is to say, prior to COVID. And as you can see, they all suffered shocks because of, as a result of COVID. China has been the first in and first out. But you can see that in all of them, the recovery will not put them back to the trajectory envisaged in January, even China, because China will suffer the toll on its growth derived from the low performance of the global economy through their exports. And it's important to highlight as well that this average for emerging market and developing economies hides the fact that you have a great variation here. Those Asian countries that managed to curb well the virus, they will have a recovery faster than the case, for instance, of the Latin American and Caribbean economies, which are probably some of them exhibiting declines of growth this year, even deeper than in the case of the advanced economies. But none of them will be able as well to return to the old trajectory. In this economic recovery has been also very much uneven when it comes to sectors. The contact intensive service remain pushed down by the remaining situation in terms of contamination and so on. And on top of that, some recent indicators like the purchase management indices and so on, they are showing signs that the pace of recovery may be slowing. There are even those who talk about the possible double dip recession in this fourth quarter. Well, when it comes to finance, We know interest rates will tend to remain low. They were low already before COVID, and they are even lower now. And overall, the financial conditions have eased, as we know, since the central bank's response to the shock in March. But we have this phenomenon, which is the combination of elevated market valuations, as you can see in the chart, alongside a recovery that is only partial. So we have this sort of disconnect between financial markets and the real economy. Those valuations, of course, they partly reflect the investor optimism about continued public support and on a quick recovery. But the point to keep in mind is that vulnerabilities are building in the financial sector. Banks' capital buffers are eroded. Non-bank financial institutions' pre-existing fragilities are heightened. And non-financial corporate sector is increasingly vulnerable to loss of access to credit, especially in the case of medium and sized enterprise. In the case of emerging markets, we saw a partial return of the capital flows that went out during the shock, but to different degrees. As you can see in this chart, depicting the evolution of the exchange rates of the emerging market economies that comprise the G20, you can see that the return of capital flows only partially has led to a recovery of levels of exchange rates in some of those countries. That's the case of Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, a bit less. But in the case of Argentina, Turkey, and even Brazil, there has been a second round of pressures of devaluation of the exchange rates. So we are far from declaring things sufficiently normalized. An important aspect to take into account as well, it will be the legacy of the coronavirus in terms of a higher public debt everywhere. Because for appropriate reasons, of course, countries, the public sectors provided fiscal and parafiscal above the line and below the line measures to countervail the dramatic impact of the tragedy of the coronavirus. And given the fact that this took place while the GDP of most countries has declined, you have an uptick, substantial in some cases, of the public debt to GDP ratio. This chart here shows how this overall common trend took place with different intensities depending on policy options. For instance, Brazil made an option for a strong policy response, and that is revealed here on its size vis-a-vis the GDP. And this was important to diminish, to minimize the damage on the GDP. Mexico made other option, and that explains why Mexico could save on the fiscal side, but is facing a deeper recession. Well, and the problem is that we're gonna watch, scars left by coronavirus. The recovery has been, as we showed, uneven and uncertain. But furthermore, the crisis will leave behind a legacy of scars in terms of higher inequality and weaker potential output growth. Inequality. Workers in contact-intensive, low and medium-skilled occupations have been particularly impacted by the crisis. The burden has fallen disproportionately on low and medium-skilled workers, as you can see on the left side of the chart. Among those cohorts of the labor market, women and youth predominate. A recent report from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, pointed out that 41% of the female labor force are employed in sectors hard hit by social distancing, like retail, tourism, and hospitality. The figure for men is 35%. But also, the impacts of the crisis on potential output are likely to be long lasting, among other reasons, because of the long lasting unemployment, which leads to loss of skills. And particularly because we are bound to watch, we are already watching it, a very hard structural shift in the job composition. You can see it on illustrated in the right side of the chart. The likely need shift of resource from sectors that might take a long time to recover, tourism, for instance, to the expanding ones, for instance, e-commerce, will likely come with structural unemployment amid skill mismatches, deteriorating the human capital of people with extended job loss. Prolonged large-scale school closures are also likely in some economies, leaving lasting scars on human capital and development. And this is reflected to a large extent in the following figures about the evolution of extreme poverty. That this estimation has been made by Brookings. See, this was the trajectory entailed or forecast for the levels of extreme poverty in the world prior to COVID, something like a gradual reduction towards levels around 6.3% of the world population by 2030. Uh, COVID has changed this forecast for this year, of course, with an increase in the number of people living under absolutely extreme poverty conditions. And this will lead to, let's say, a less favorable trajectory over the following years. So, what are the takeaways? First, extensive policy support has averted much worse outcomes than the ones that we saw, and they will need to be maintained until the crisis is behind us. But a second important remark is that the focus should gradually shift toward one, retraining and reskilling the jobless to facilitate employment in the newly expanding sectors. And two, the focus should also be maintained on supporting viable or strategic firms to minimize unnecessary bankruptcies. Monetary and financial sector policies should remain accommodative while maintaining stability. Trying to look ahead to see how to bolster medium-term growth and build resilience, it's important to highlight that there will be large-scale public and private investment needs to rebuild from the crisis, and they make up an opportunity to address long-standing challenges. Enhancing access to opportunities, including through digitalization, can broaden inclusion and help lift the global growth potential harmed by coronavirus. Also, mitigation of climate change. We know that that climate change will require zero net carbon emissions by 2050. And this can be done in a way that bolsters recovery and creates jobs. I'm talking about, obviously, green recovery. And the final point, multilateral action is needed to end the crisis for everyone. Let me single out two examples. It is essential to make operational the proposed common framework for debt resolution for economies with unsustainable sovereign debt, which is the case of many low-income countries as of now. And second, uh, given the lift in public debt to GDP, uh, most economies will need to probably raise taxation in the following years. And the system for taxing multinational enterprise should reduce the scope for tax avoidance, which is also obviously something that will demand multilateral cooperation. Thank you.